Hi, and welcome back to Recovery His Way on the campus of the His Way Recovery Center in Huntsville, Alabama. I'm Stuart Whiting, sitting down once again with our director, Tom Reynolds. Good afternoon, Tom.
Good to see you, Stuart.
Yeah, we're going to continue in our discussion on ethics, and really is a pretty broad topic for anyone to think about, and particularly Christians, and maybe with some application into our view of recovery. And what we've done in the first couple of weeks here is introduce the idea of moving from the general way of looking at ethics and being reactive and just reacting to what people do to me, to trying to embrace the golden rule and wanting to do to others as we want to have done to us, and everyone's familiar with that, but really going deeper into the gospel rule. And as you word it, that we are to do to others as God has done for us and to us. And we've been introducing particular elements within that ethic. And the first element we looked at was the Christmas ethic, right, and in Jesus' coming and what that revealed about what God believes about interaction with people. So why don't you walk us through a quick recap of the Christmas ethic?
Right. So, yeah, I mean, ethics in my mind has to do with, in a Christian, Christ-centered ethic, ethics has to do with how God fundamentally interacts with man.
Yeah.
And then because of the gospel rule, then the call of Christianity is to treat others the way God's treated you. So then the ethic is embodied really in Jesus, because Jesus is ultimately the way God interacts with man. Yeah. He's the conduit. He's the answer. He's the plan of how God intends to interact with us. So Jesus then, because the embodiment of this ethic, instead of just kind of Christian ethical principles based on verses you find in the Bible or something like that, it's embedded in the nature of who Christ is. And so the Christmas ethic is one of the aspects of that, right? Because the incarnation, Jesus, God saying, I so love the world that I want to do something for you, so I send my one and only Son. He's God in human flesh. It becomes the fundamental beginning of that ethical engagement. So the three things I emphasize in the Christmas ethic are love. One, obviously, for God so loved that he gave. So the fact that Jesus came, or that God came in the form of Jesus, is part of the expression of ethics. So how love then drives our engagement with one another. Right. And then because love is a giving thing, fundamentally in that passage in John 3:16 as well, so then giving becomes another part of that ethic, that it's about giving and sharing, and not just about giving in the sense of, my end of the year donation or things like that, but deeper, it's a giving of one's life. It's a giving of one's energy. It's an energy that instead of interacting to take, it interacts to give. And I think that
it initiates. Right. Yeah, it looks for ways to give.
Right. I mean, and you see that fundamentally even in the Beatitudes, because, as you follow the Beatitudes, we've discussed this before on this program, Jesus starts with blessed are the poor in spirit. And he goes through this kind of emptying oneself, the mourning and the meekness, and then has a hunger and thirst for righteousness. And that in that righteousness is a satisfaction. And then all the rest of the Beatitudes that come from their mercy and pure in heart are all about kind of then an outflow of, now that I've been emptied, I'm now filled up with something new. I now have this outflow that happens in my life. And so one of the fundamental transformations I think that happen in Christianity is we go from a human emptiness in which we're always engaged to get things, whether it's a bigger paycheck or get somebody to like me or love me or whatever, to this satisfaction that then I interact with life in order to give, engaging that direction. So
it reminds me of Paul saying, if I'm being poured out as like a drink offering for your benefit, then I glorify God for that. That's what my life's purpose is.
Right. So that's where the giving is about. And then a part of that too, the other aspect of the incarnation I thought about was in Philippians 2, where Jesus didn't consider equality with God something to be held on to, but was willing to let go of that position and humble himself, and not just humble himself to become human, which is obviously humiliating for a God to have to do in the first place, but to go beyond that to go, submit himself to the human beings, to be ultimately executed in a humiliating fashion, becomes kind of a part of the core element to me of the Christmas story, is this birth in a manger type of thing, this stable, I've said to the guys many times, I know, probably none of us were born in a barn, and yet the guy who came to save us was born beneath us in terms of that kind of thing.
Not the story we would have written if we were bringing the king into the world.
Right. Exactly.
And and it's not one that maybe it's a shocking subtext of God coming. It's like, oh great, well God's coming to love us, but the nature and the way he comes. Of course, Paul goes on to say in that same passage in Philippians 2, not only being obedient unto death, but to death through a cross.
Right.
And I know that's the second kind of element that you see in this and from Jesus' life that really shouts a message to us about what an ethic should look like between how God is interacting with man is the cross ethic. Right. So let's kind of begin to talk about that.
So obviously a big part of the gospel message, this gospel ethic, is not only did God come, but then what did he do when he got here? And ultimately that's expressed across. And when I say cross ethic, I don't just mean, those few moments that Jesus was hanging on one, but the whole experience that Jesus had of the sacrificial lifestyle that he lived. So I really see that in this. And so I would begin with the cross ethic with the idea of accountability. And I say that for this reason, because the cross fundamentally is an expression that there's a responsibility for things we have, that God's going to hold us responsible for something, that there's an accounting of things. And I think that's really important. I want to go back for a second to kind of set the premise for that. So, God created us in his image, as we've discussed many times, and we're fallen from that image because of the fall in Genesis 3. And, God observes, right, as the Noah story begins, right, that the hearts of man are deceitful all the time, that he doesn't seem to be able to muster hardly any good, and that type of thing. And so God plans this, universal flood, this wiping out. It's kind of starting over again. He was kind of starting from scratch with 8 people.
Yeah.
And starting over again. And even after, he cleans everything up and has the 8 people, he still looks at those 8 people and says, and they're kind of like that too, because by the end of it, it's all said that, man's heart really hadn't changed at all. And we're going to kind of have to suffer through that experience. So one of the things you see is over and over again, Jeremiah says, the heart is deceitful above all else and desperately sick. Who can understand it? So we're kind of told through scripture over and over again, this nature of man that's fallen, deceitful, broken. And even later on, Paul will say, that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So we're all in this situation where we've sinned. And one of the things I think is important here is that we're responsible for that. The wage of sin is death, right? So there's a consequence. And I think that's really important in our ethic, that it's an ethic that is consequential. That's what I mean by accountability, that there's a consequence to these things. And I think that's important for us to understand. And it's important for us as we engage this ethic to realize God operates from a consequential point of view. And that if we're going to operate like that, we need to be willing to have accountability and consequences as well, both accept the consequences of our choices on us, as well as hold other people responsible for the consequences that they have as well. So I think that's kind of what we're talking about here in my mind. If you remember, at the end of Moses' life, he brings the people of Israel to this moment, right, where they have to choose. I tell you about the curses versus the blessings. You have a choice. He says, choose life, choose this. Right. However, it's up to you. Yeah. You choose. God honors that choice. That's a part of the nature of God. And Jesus does the very same thing. He spells, starts with the Beatitudes and goes through this whole Sermon on the Mount. By the time he gets to the end of it, he says, okay, now it's up to you. You have a narrow road, you have a broad road. You choose. Now he says, just like Moses did, choose the narrow road. Yeah. However, up to you.
Yeah.
But the consequences will now be yours, right, for either one of those choices.
Build your house on the solid rock, right, or on, you've heard this, take my teachings to heart, or no.
Right.
And
and face the consequences thereof. And so I think accountability is an important part of the ethic that we have to embrace here. And I think it's an important one in our culture. Right. Because we, those who have resource can many times compensate for those who do not. And so we end up kind of not allowing people to experience the consequences of their choices. Unfortunately, parents do that a lot with their children, which then creates this irresponsible prolonged adolescence and all these kind of things that become problematic for people trying to grow into adulthood. Because fundamentally, being an adult is the ability to manage your consequences.
Yeah.
And so I think that's an important principle with this cross. You know, when I think about these ethics, and I'm applying them particularly to recovery here in our recovery program, is, you know, this is an important principle, is being willing to enforce consequences. We have rules here. We say, we have a house meeting every Tuesday night. I say every week, you got a rule book, make sure you read the rules. You know, the staff knows the rules. You gotta know the rules because we're expecting you to behave by these rules. And there will be consequences for not. And some people say, oh, that's harsh. No, that's the gospel. It's part of the cross.
We all live, whether we've written them down or not, with a set of rules that we expect others, you know. And so to back up and say, oh, well, that's just, you know, being too harsh. It's like, well, everyone has a standard of some sort.
Right.
And so it doesn't mean that there's not wisdom and flex, you know, some flexibility to really talk through situations, but it's like, this is the expectation. This is a starting point. And in a more structured, formal setting, you just have to have that. And we're not hiding anything from anyone. And I know we're gone through a situation recently where a family has, because we held to, you know, the standards and the rules and, you know, put them in a situation they thought was unfair and that might look poorly upon the resident who was going to be dismissed and might have some, you know, ripples into legal situations they had about finishing the situation. And it's easy to want to step back and go, okay, well, we'll just, you know, we'll do something different here. But, you know, it's like ultimately there's got to be some integrity around what we're saying, held and accountable for.
Most of the guys that I experience in this program have come from families that some regard have kind of covered up their consequences. So they run ahead and they say, well, I know Jimmy did da-da-da. Can you give him an A anyway? Can you do this anyway? Can you, you know, because if he doesn't get an A, then he won't get this and he'll lose his scholarship or blah, 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 or whatever that is. And at some point, the only way Jimmy's going to grow up is to experience the consequences of those choices. And God set it up originally that way. That's a part of I think that's, again, why I call it part of the cross ethic, because fundamentally, there is a consequence for sin. God doesn't just say, oh, I'll turn a blind eye to that. Oh, we'll just we'll kind of pass over. That's probably the wrong word here in the sense of the concept. But it's the idea. I'm not just going to kind of overlook this. There's going to have to be a price that's paid. And the grace of God, obviously in the gospel, is that Jesus is the one that then comes and pays the price. But the cross says there's still a consequence.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think that's important in this accountability. And that's an important part of the ethic that I think is important. I know we don't like holding people accountable. We like, you know, kind of cutting people slack, letting people off, those kind of things, because we don't want conflict. We don't want to hurt people's feelings, but we're not helping people. And God doesn't operate that way. God says, no, there's consequences, which kind of lines up with what I would say the next part of this is, and that is that there's a sacrifice. Mm. That this cross also says that there's a sacrifice, that love is sacrificial, right? That Jesus came and died and offered his body as a living sacrifice for us. And so part of this cross ethic is that we engage people sacrificially, that we do it for their benefit and our cost at some level. And so that's really important too. Because we're engaging in a giving way, we engage in a sacrificial way. That becomes part of the nature.
Yeah, I think that's one of when I hear stories of guys who are telling about their own transformation, that always seems to be a key part of it, is to see other people that have sacrificed on their behalf, right? And just how loud a message, you know, that sends of, because that's not normal. That's absolutely, that's when you're really going deep into a gospel ethic versus even the golden rule. When you're willing to go into a sacrificial moment, and people, in fact, it's happened with one of our guys who are currently only been here for a few weeks, didn't have any money coming in, but you know, other people outside were trying to help him. And he's like, hey, has any money gone towards my entry fee? And I told him, it's like, yeah. And you know, so I have a check from so-and-so on your books. And they're like, really? Wow, I met them. I just would never expect that. Why would they do that? And it's like all of a sudden because they're living by the gospel and they've been moved in their heart to do something on your behalf that, doesn't cost you anything, but and it just is, it's like, this is something different about this.
Right. So the cross, you see Jesus on this cross. And like I said, the cross ethic isn't just about the cross itself, but it's about his whole life. But you see Jesus on this cross and you see the sacrifice. And I think that sacrifice is something that's kind of built into this whole process, right? Of one passage I was thinking about, I just wanted to read real quickly, is in 1 Peter 2, in verse 21, Peter says, "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you might follow in his steps." Mm-hmm. Right? But this sacrifice isn't just about suffering. This suffering, it goes deeper than that, because it says he committed no sin. In other words, he's suffering for something he did not do. Right? He committed no sin. Neither was deceit found in his mouth. Right? Well, the Bible says, "Hard man is deceitful all the time." Right? There's no deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he didn't revile or return. He didn't practice the first ethic there, reactive, right? When he suffered, he didn't threaten, but continued to entrust himself to him who judges justly. He bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin, live to righteousness. By his wounds you've been healed. And I think that, to me, that picture is such a powerful one, because Christ said, "Therefore you should walk in his steps," right? So this sacrificial way of life, it means that you bear the brunt of other people's sin. Right. Jesus obviously is the ultimate sin bearer. However, if we walk in his steps, that means that we are also equally sin bearers, that I'm willing to bear the bad decisions of other people. Yeah. That's a part of how I interact. I mean, and that's, if you think about it, it's fundamental to love. The way we manage relationships isn't that you're perfect and I'm perfect, but that when I disappoint you, you're going to bear that disappointment, right, and continue to maintain a relationship with me.
Yeah, and tying that to the first point about accountability, it's not, well, I'm just going to let you off the hook. We're going to walk through it together, right, and bear the burden. You're not leaving the person high and dry with their consequences, but I'm going to walk through it together. I think of one of our staff members who's gone very deep into this way of thinking, with helping with our transition houses, right, and helping guys, employing them, getting jobs, and being often the one being called late at night and when times are tough, and a guy, and he is walking through the consequences of those. He's not letting them off the hook, but he's in it, and it wears him down at times. And you know what I'm talking about. But he has so much love for these guys, and he wants to live out this, what he has received from Jesus. He wants to walk through, and boy, it's really taxing. And yet he knows it's a calling that he wants to walk in.
One of the things I try to point out to parents as we're raising kids, and to our staff at times as we're raising kids too here, is that a part of the parenting process is you hold people accountable, and then you have to suffer the consequences that they are going through. Because, for instance, if you all of a sudden suspend your child's driving privileges because they're misbehaving in some way, then who takes them to school tomorrow?
Right.
And good parenting says, okay, I'm willing to suffer that. I'm willing to make that sacrifice in order to help make this point and hold them accountable to something. Versus just, oh, that's inconvenient for me. Well, I'll give you your keys for school at least. But
just better be careful next time.
Because good accountability is willing to go through their own personal sacrifice to see that accountability executed. And I think that's really an important principle. I try to tell our staff that you may want to bring a consequence to somebody, but just understand that you will suffer with them in that consequence. If you all of a sudden say, okay, no TV for a week, well, then you got to deal with, what are you going to do to keep these guys occupied? What do you do when you want to just turn on the TV and keep them, pacified? Now you got to deal with that. Yeah. And so there's things you're going to have to do that, and all of a sudden go, oh, I really want to watch something on TV. Oh, I'm sorry. Didn't we say the TVs are off limits? So I guess the staff's going to have to go with something else too. It's like, oh, okay. Right. So then you start sacrificing as you hold people accountable and that type of thing. So I think sacrifice is a big part of one of the things, stories I teach the guys, and And remember about Jesus is there's a story in Mark chapter 1 where Jesus heals a leper. And as he sends him back home after that, we can imagine a leper, somebody who's alienated from everybody, isolated from everybody, no hope, no future, no anything. And all of a sudden that's been totally flipped. That's totally revolutionized, right? I can get my family, I got a job, I got a future. He wants to run home and tell everybody, right? Jesus says, don't do that. Go to the priest, show yourself clean to him, go through the process, the same process that took you out of the community. You go back through that door and you go through into the community and you respect that process. Well, he doesn't do that. He just goes running home. And it's interesting because then the consequence, it's not like Jesus goes, oh, so therefore you violated that, so I'm just going to zap you with leprosy again. I mean, he could have, I'm sure, but that's not what Jesus does. Is he bears the consequence for that one in that case, right? He goes through the sacrifice of that guy's disobedience. The guy doesn't suffer as much as Jesus suffers, and now he can't continue in the city doing his ministry because he's so inundated with people. He has to go, and he's limited in what he's tried to accomplish because of this guy's disobedience. And so there's times in which we are sacrificing for others, and that's, I think, fundamental to the gospel.
Yeah. Okay.
And then the other part of the cross, obviously, is the result of these things is forgiveness. And forgiveness is a costly grace. And I think that's really important to emphasize that grace is costly. Again, I think we tend to think of grace as well, I'll look the other way. We'll pass over that one. We're not going to deal with it. No, it's deeper than that. I mean, for instance, Jesus tells the story in Matthew 18, right, about the master who's holding his servants responsible for their debts. And this guy comes with this enormous debt, unpayable. I mean, Jesus obviously in hyperbole has created this incredible, inordinate debt, the kind of debt that I guess the American government has.
Right. An individual just so never going to get out from it.
Right. And the master in pity and in mercy and grace forgives the guy his debt. And then he goes out and begins choking somebody for a much less,
for $500. Right. Yeah.
To get something back. And there's an appalling response to it because even the rest of the church, how could you do that? What's the problem here? And so there's obviously strong reaction to that. And I mean, the master even calls the servant wicked and evil, which I think is a powerful statement about from the kingdom of God. What's really evil here? It's this unwillingness to extend what God's extended to you to other people.
Right.
And the thing that I noticed there, though, is it's not like the king, when he forgave him, that he was just, again, letting him off the hook. He was going to incur the consequence of that. I'm choosing grace says, I will incur the cost of your debt here. I will absorb that, and I will let you go. And I think the cross says that. God's saying through Jesus, I am willing to absorb your sin for you. And that forgiveness is about that. It's about the willingness to absorb other people's sin in order to maintain a relationship, in order to express love, in order to reconcile relationships. Again, they're not going to be perfect. They're not going to behave perfectly, but my love for you, I remember Clyde Jones, who's our founder, he really lived that very consistently in his life and would emphasize it to me often, where I'd see someone say, well, I mean, that guy totally mistreated you. You shouldn't let him do that. I mean, what should we do here? And Clyde's response was always, well, we're going to let love rule this one. And I'm going to, I'm not going to hold this guy, I'm not going to hold it over his head. I'm going to forgive him. I'm going to send grace here because my relationship with him matters more than whatever the other things are. And God's basically, ultimately, the gospel says, God says, my relationship with you matters more than anything you've ever done.
Yeah. And the other side of that coin, if you will, from the one giving forgiveness from God's standpoint, and sacrificing, is certainly the approach we want to have front and center. But there is, on the other one receiving, even back to the parable, there should be something that changes,
right?
And that's back to the being accountable. And I think of Titus, where Paul says, for the grace of God has appeared, offer salvation so that we can say no to ungodliness. It changes us. And that's, I think, a cause for our own reflection to say, how deeply are we invested in the forgiveness of God if it's not changing us? And so we do hope. I mean, it's not the reason you forgive, but you hope that as you forgive, that's another thing that will change a person and say, well, that's not the way the world works. You know, these again are these hallmark expressions of the gospel ethic, which say there is something fundamentally different about this person. And how can that be? Right. How can a person be like that, which drives them hopefully to ask questions and to seek out, this salvation that is driving this strange behavior in others.
And in a bigger picture, I think in terms of what we experience here at His Way, I think that's what causes the people to be so attracted to the gospel. Isn't that we preach this sermon or quote these scriptures at people, but that they see that kind of cross ethic being lived out, engaged among each other, and it draws people, and then they want to kind of discover and learn why people are behaving this way. I've had it said more than a few times that, guys, particularly coming off the streets out of addiction, are saying, one of the hardest things to get used to is that people were doing things for me just out of the kindness of their heart. They weren't doing it to get something. They weren't doing it because they were going to now expect something of me, but they were just doing it because it was who they are.
Not keeping score, not keeping a ledger. I mean, I'm of 30 times more instances I do of, but people who are walking away owing other people a lot of money because they're trying to help and trying to do things, not for excusing bad consequences and that kind of thing, but trying to set people up in new paths and, waiting for things to work out. And, that's part of it. Mm-hmm. That's part of it. And it's not what we're going to come back later and that person circles back around and it's like, well, let's figure out how to go forward from here. So I told you beforehand, I might have a quote if it fit in, and I think it does. And because I saw in your note, I'm going to get my glasses here for once to read. And it's a really famous book by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as I'm well aware, The Cost of Discipleship. And I just love what he says about costly grace. And I think he had such a rich theology about, and of course, lived out in his own experience of being a Christian who was opposed to the Nazi, regime and cost him his life ultimately. So he understands what, costly grace looks like. But I love how he puts this, that costly grace is the treasure hidden in the field. For the sake of it, a man will go and sell all that he has. It is the pearl of great price to buy, which the merchant will sell all his goods. It is the kingly rule of Christ, for whose sake a man will pluck out the eye, which causes him to stumble. It is the call of Jesus Christ at which the disciple leaves his nets and follows him. I mean, we have just story after story about what Christ and the Gospels are trying to teach us about this. And ultimately, he says that this grace is costly because it calls us to follow. And that's that wanting, what the desire we have for our men here, that as we extend grace and forgiveness and establishing that, there's an accountability that goes with receiving this and walking into a new life. And that's because we, as Paul says, and when you quoted Romans 6 earlier, there's a long discussion there about we're all slaves to something. Right. The question is, are we slaves to sin that's going to lead to death? Are we going to be slaves to Christ and that leads to righteousness? And it's costly because we are still giving our lives over. And so it's going to cost us something. But boy, the end of the road, as you quoted, the narrow road that leads unto salvation and eternal life. And that's all that matters in the end of things, not all the things along the way. That's right. So next week we'll add the third element here from Christ's life, and we'll maybe hold that off as a teaser. So thanks for sharing this. This is just actually a beautiful lesson that you've put together, and you do a great job of distilling down a lot of things from the gospel text and from the New Testament into your nice alliteration, which you always do so beautifully, and some key thoughts to help us organize our thoughts around and calling us to be thoughtful about what we're doing in this ministry and in our Christian lives. So thank you for that.
It's my pleasure.
Oh yeah. And thank you for joining us today on the podcast. And if you have any questions about His Way, would like more information about our ministry, you can find us on the internet at hiswayinc.org.